As crack cocaine tore through Washington, D.C., a drug gang fought to take control.
What up? Huh? Papers at?
Authorities fought back with everything they had. But gang members used any means to avoid prosecution. As the violence raged out of control, law enforcement would take back the streets.
In the early 1990s, Washington, D.C. became the murder capital of the nation. Few were left untouched by gang violence, which was ignited by the drug trade. By 1994, that violence would strike at the very heart of law enforcement. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office, who would fall to the FBI to lead an international manhunt and bring in the leader of the city's most vicious gang.
October 26, 1994. The nation's capital was about to become the backdrop to another bloody crime. Just before midnight, 3 masked gunmen broke into a home in the northwest section of the city.
Get up! Get up! Get up! Now! Get up!
They targeted Gerald Gaither, demanding his cash and drugs.
Where's the money? Where's the money? Where's the money? Where's it at? Where's the money?
He turned over what little money he had in his pockets.
Get up!
The owner of the home, William Ragland, was accosted while working in his basement.
Where's the money at? Get out here.
Upstairs, one of the gunmen discovered Nancy Hatchett and Darlene Hatchett, Ragland's daughter and granddaughter.
Get out there. Get to the room. Go!
To convince Gaither to cooperate, the gunmen terrorized each of the residents.
Get out! Get out!
The women were ordered to lie face down on the floor.
Get out! Hands out! Tell us, come on, old man. Come on, old man. Tell us where the money is. Where is it? Where is it?
Gaither denied having more cash or drugs.
Put your hands down now.
One of the gunmen turned his .22 caliber handgun towards Ragland. The 89-year-old retired federal worker died instantly.
Tell us where it is. Play games.
Andre Madison, another resident, was hustled into the living
Shut
room.
up.
One of the 3 attackers noticed his gold necklace and ripped it from his neck.
Get down. Get out. Get out. Face down. Face down. Face down. Shut up. Shut up.
Though one man was dead, Gaither still refused to cooperate.
Get out. Get out. What are you doing?
Enraged, one of the gunmen began shooting the residents. The robbery attempt collapsed into murder. The trio quickly fled the house. One of the attackers vomited near the back door. Nancy Hatchett called 911. Officers from D.C.'s Metropolitan Police Department quickly arrived at the house, located in a known drug area. Inside, 3 people were dead. William Ragland, his granddaughter Darlene Hatchett, and Gerald Gaither. Pictures were taken of each body, and shell casings were collected. Outside, police discovered vomit near the door.
Hey, how you doing?
Nancy Hatchett and Andre Madison, the only survivors, tried to help police develop suspects. But the attackers were masked, making identification difficult.
Okay.
For Metropolitan Homicide Detective Anthony Brigadini, a check on victim Gerald Gaither suggested a possible motive.
The main victim of the triple was a drug dealer in the First and Kennedy Street area. The guy drove flashy cars, had nice clothes, had a lot of money. When the drug dealer was unable to give them enough money and or drugs, things started to get a little harried, and that's when the shootings occurred inside.
Neighbors told police that after hearing gunshots, they saw a dark-colored sedan with a loud muffler leaving the area. An all-points bulletin was issued for the vehicle and 3 men inside. One hour after the murders, 2 D.C. cops spotted a noisy vehicle that fit the report. Noticing 3 men inside the vehicle, the officers pulled over the gray Oldsmobile. The police asked the men for identification. The driver was identified as Benny Lee Lawson. The passengers were determined to be Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves. In one of their pants pockets, police recovered a broken gold necklace. But details from the murder scene were still incomplete. To the officers, the necklace was meaningless. After recording all of the men's names and addresses, the 3 were soon released. There was no evidence in the car to connect them to the murders. Despite the lack of solid suspects, homicide detectives believed that Gerald Gaither had been murdered by a rival drug gang. By 1990, crack cocaine had hit the streets of Washington, D.C. Neighborhood gangs began to emerge throughout the city when it became clear that there was a lot of money to be made from dealing the drug. As more and more money flowed to the gangs, they resorted to violence to protect their turf from rival drug dealers. By 1994, the nation's capital was averaging nearly 400 homicides a year. D.C. police joined forces with the FBI and several federal agencies to combat the drug-related violence. Most of the murders remained unsolved. Hoping to rattle free a lead in the triple murder, detectives began canvassing the neighborhood where the murders took place. Neighbors were too afraid to openly cooperate. Some were willing to phone in information anonymously. One tip led to Benny Lee Lawson, one of the 3 men pulled over the night of the homicides. Investigators learned that the gold necklace taken from Andre Madison matched the one officers found on one of the men in Lawson's car. Detective Brigadini questioned Lawson.
Lawson's interview lasted about 3 or 4 hours, and different detectives went in and spent some time with Lawson in an attempt to get him to provide some sort of information about his involvement in the triple murder.
Sit up. Look at me.
Lawson repeatedly denied having any knowledge of the triple murder and refused to take a polygraph test. Investigators tried to shake his story with the false threat that they could put him at the murder scene through a DNA test of the recovered vomit. Lawson remained unswayed. After 4 hours, police had no choice but to release him. Lawson's name was run through the crime database. He had been identified by police intelligence units as a member of one of D.C.'s most violent and feared street gangs. The First and Kennedy Street Crew, named after the city blocks the group lived on and controlled. Organized in 1988, the crew was involved in drug dealing, theft, kidnappings, drive-by shootings, and murder. The men with Benny Lawson the night of the murders, Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves, confronted him about the long hours he spent with the homicide detectives. They believed he had snitched and told the police about the gang's involvement in the triple murder. Lawson was infuriated by the accusation. He hated the police. He assured the two that he had revealed nothing to investigators. Since no arrests had been made, Graves was confident the cops had no evidence. Mowat was not as sure. He declared that he would leave the country rather than be indicted for murder. Lawson vowed he would never go back to prison where he once had been raped.
What they asking?
Lawson returned home that night. Being labeled a snitch was an insult to his loyalty towards the crew. And for a gang member on the streets, it was a death sentence. He was committed to gaining back the respect of the crew, proving that he was not a snitch. On November 22nd, 1994, a few days before Thanksgiving, Benny Lawson returned to Metropolitan Police Department headquarters. It was around 3:15 p.m. He was trying to locate the homicide department he had visited several days earlier.
Hey.
He asked two teenagers for directions.
If you're going that way, through that door right there.
They mistakenly led him to the cold case squad.
Okay, well, we'll see you
The
then.
team inside the office was made up of personnel from the MPD and the FBI, whose job was to breathe life into the growing number of unsolved homicide investigations. Inside the office were FBI agents Martha Dixon Martinez, John Kufta, Mike Miller, and Metropolitan Police Sergeant Hank Daly. The teenagers, who were there for a scheduled appointment, began to speak with the officers. With no warning, Lawson pulled out his M11 assault handgun and started firing. The headquarters of the Washington, D.C. police was under attack. Repeated gunfire echoed through Washington, D.C. police headquarters. Detectives raced to the third-floor office where the shooting continued. No one knew what was going on behind the locked doors of the cold case squad room.
Come on, open up the door! Open up the door!
Across town at the FBI's Washington field office,
Hey, Tony, what do you have? All right, I'll talk to you later.
It was just a normal day like any other day, and we were monitoring one of the police radios, and we heard a call go out that there had been a shooting at MPD headquarters.
Okay, we're on our
agents
way.
quickly determined the shooting was taking place inside the cold case office, where several FBI agents were on duty.
And very quickly we started to page our agents that were assigned to the cold case homicide squad to try to account for all of them. And as time progressed, we weren't hearing back from some of the agents, and we realized that we might have some agents inside there. And as we listened, the calls became more serious and they were requesting assistance.
Critically wounded, Special Agent John Kufta was trapped inside the cold case squad office. When the shooting had stopped, he could hear the shouts from officers outside the office trying to get in. Help was just a few feet away.
At that point, I heard a voice tell me they couldn't get in, and I thought to myself, I'm not going to die in here. I thought of, my wife, my 8-month-old daughter at the time, and I knew that if I stayed awake, if I continued to breathe, if I continued to pray, and if they got me to a hospital, I'd be alive.
Shot in the thigh, arm, stomach, neck, and chest, Kufta managed to open the door. Detectives pulled him out. The only other visible person to the rescuers was Metropolitan Police Sergeant Hank Daly. Barely clinging to life, he was dragged from the room. He was rushed outside where a helicopter waited to transport him to the hospital. Not knowing if the shooter was planning another ambush, the officers waited for the SWAT team to arrive. FBI agents and SWAT teams from around the Capitol converged on the Metropolitan Police headquarters. Yells continued from inside the room as the SWAT team arrived. Heavily armed, they entered the room. They first discovered FBI agent Mike Miller's body. His weapon was still in its holster. In an adjoining room, the SWAT team discovered the body of an unidentified black male. There was a gunshot wound on his hip and a fatal wound to his head. FBI agent Martha Dixon Martinez was the final victim found. She had gunshot wounds in her back. Near her lay the gun the shooter had likely used to kill her and the others, an M11 assault weapon. Shouts for help came from inside a closet.
Suspect in the closet, open the door slowly!
Not knowing if he was a suspect or an innocent bystander, the SWAT team apprehended one of the teens who had walked in the room before the shooting began. The other teenager had managed to flee the office earlier after being shot in the leg.
I don't even know the guy.
Supervisory Special Agent Mark Giuliano and other agents arrived at the scene.
I just remember walking through the hallway and just seeing the chaotic scene and the blood and just the total realm of emotions on everybody's face, from being focused on the mission of trying to figure out what happened and could there be other people involved.
Based on the crime scene analysis, investigators quickly reconstructed what had happened inside the room.
Getting all those shells over there?
Yes.
After Miller, Kufta, and Daly were ambushed, Agent Dixon Martinez joined the firefight. She was able to shoot the suspect in the hip before being shot in the arm, dropping her gun. The attacker took her 9mm handgun and shot the agent in the back as she tried to crawl for cover. He then put the gun to his own head and pulled the trigger. Police fingerprinted the shooter. Hopefully his identity would shed light on his actions. 2 FBI agents were dead. Sergeant Hank Daly would not survive his injuries. It would be the first time in 8 years that more than one FBI agent had been killed at a single time. It was also one of the worst attacks in history on the DC police. Agent Kufta would endure 7 major medical operations before recovering. The loss of his co-workers, Sergeant Hank Daly, Agents Mike Miller and Martha Dixon Martinez, was devastating.
Martha, Mike, and Hank were law enforcement heroes. They didn't as much lose their lives as gave their lives for a cause of justice, for a cause that they so deeply believed.
Within hours, the investigation was moving forward. The fingerprints of the shooter had come back.
When the information came up about the identity of the shooter, a detective had the information, came into a conference area where the majority of the homicide officials and detectives were, and it was announced that the shooter was Benny Lee Lawson, Jr.
When homicide detective Anthony Brigadini heard the news, he realized his squad was the probable target of Lawson's rampage. Lawson and the First and Kennedy Street crew were the prime suspects in the triple murder of William Ragland, Darlene Hatchett, and Gerald Gaither. The shootings at headquarters showed just how far the gangs would go to protect themselves.
I think that law enforcement as a whole has learned that people operating gangs or crews are serious about what it is that they're doing. They won't stop at any cost to get their mission accomplished.
Now that federal officers had been murdered, the FBI was given jurisdiction in the investigation of the crew.
Let's go. I was detailed to work jointly with the FBI to investigate the First and Kennedy Street crew, who at that time we felt were responsible for essentially Lawson's actions here at police headquarters.
After joining the task force, Brigadini shared what he knew about Benny Lawson and the crew. Special Agent John Kerr was on the team. For him, Benny Lawson's connection with the First and Kennedy Street crew raised serious questions.
Was this just a random act by Benny Lee Lawson, or were there accomplices? Did he have any help in this? Were there be any further attacks on agents and police? And so that was a reason that we opened up an investigation to answer those questions. Was this a conspiracy?
Investigators obtained a search warrant that night for the house Lawson had lived in.
Please get out! Please get out!
In his room, they uncovered a note written to the members of the DC homicide unit who had interrogated him, threatening to kill them. Gang-related materials, violent rap lyrics, and drawings of murders were everywhere. For investigators, the items in Lawson's room reflected a fixation with violence common to virtually all gang members.
It was very obvious and disturbing that these individuals were living this lifestyle. This is the lifestyle that they were a part of. This is the lifestyle that they identified with, and they wanted to actually live the same lifestyle as the lyrics that they were writing, the pictures they were drawing, and the videos that they had.
As the victims of the shootings were laid to rest, investigators were planning their strategy to ensure that these gang members could never kill again. With 6 homicides on their hands, including 2 FBI agents and a Washington, D.C. police detective, a joint FBI MPD task force began gathering information on the First and Kennedy Street crew. FBI agent Mark Giuliano headed up the task force.
And our goal was to, A, investigate the crew because they were a violent street gang, and B, to try to determine what the motivation was of Benny Lee Lawson to come into police headquarters and do what he did, and to determine if there was anybody else involved at either end, either in helping him get there to pull off what he did or helping the crew afterwards to cover up what had happened.
In the wake of the shootings at MPD headquarters, police pressure on gang members increased. The crew members reacted by spending less time on the streets. Building a case against them for their criminal activity would be difficult. The crew was impenetrable to outsiders. Planting an undercover agent inside the gang was too dangerous.
What we realized is that, A, we had a very close crew. That is, they took care of each other and watched each other very closely, but they were very, very leery of outsiders. They had been leery before, but they were even more leery now, and that any attempts for us to get somebody, an agent or a police officer on the inside, was not something that we were going to even attempt to do.
Instead, agents would have to gather intelligence on the crew through covert surveillance. As time went on, the gang returned to business as usual. The FBI was watching.
We had extensive surveillance coverage of the area, day and night, identifying everyone that came onto the block, identifying who the buyers were, what time of day, where did they go when they bought, did they get into a car, did they go into an alleyway, did they do it hand to hand right there in front of you. All these things we started to take notice of and document.
Through surveillance, the leaders of the crew were soon identified. Kobe Mowat and his second-in-command, Jermaine Graves, the two men in the car with Benny Lawson the night of the first triple homicide. On the streets, Mowat was known to be violent and unpredictable.
The reputation of Kobe Mowat was that of fear, that he would react quickly. At times he had a temper. He always carried a gun and could be extremely violent at times.
Looking into Kobe's past, investigators discovered he shared a common history with Graves and with Benny Lawson. Their relationship developed in 1990 while serving together in Washington, D.C.'s Lorton Prison, located in Northern Virginia. They had been arrested and convicted for weapons violations while preparing for a drive-by shooting in another gang.
Do you know what happened to me?
The task force members were convinced that Mowat and Graves played some role in all 6 murders. But the leaders of the First and Kennedy Street crew continued to keep a low profile. Agents devised a long-term strategy that would net not only Mowat and Graves, but also the entire gang membership. They would slowly build a conspiracy case against the crew that would include the entire range of their criminal activities, from crack cocaine trafficking to murder.
Off the street, well, back in 4:30. Hang on to those for me.
Agents would work themselves inside by first targeting individuals who regularly purchased their drugs from the crew. This would allow them to watch and record the gang committing crimes. And by arresting the buyers, agents would have leverage to turn them into informants.
We'd come into an area when we thought that they'd be the most active in selling drugs. And in order to identify someone and hopefully get lucky, catch someone with some drugs, and maybe force them to work for us at some point.
Some of the buyers arrested were unwilling to cooperate at first. The dangerous reputations of Mowat and Graves were well known. But the threat of long prison sentences was powerful. The FBI strategy paid off. Threatened with significant jail time, one of the biggest drug suppliers to the crew decided to become an informant. At the FBI's direction, he would generate conversation with crew members about their illegal activities.
And he'd have conversations with them, and they like to brag about what they've done. And at our direction, he would bring something up, say an old drive-by shooting or an old murder, or something about drug dealing. And these individuals would just start to talk about it. They'd talk about who was involved, what happened. All of this was being recorded.
Through the informant and the recordings, agents learned that Mowat, Graves, and Lawson had killed previously. Less than 3 weeks before breaking into William Ragland's house, they had kidnapped and murdered another rival drug dealer.
What up, boy? What up? Huh?
William Red Billy Woods was a well-known dealer from a rival gang. Jermaine Graves arranged to lure Woods to his mother's house. Once there, Mowat, Graves, and Lawson robbed him and beat him. Fearing the rival gang would retaliate against the crew, they shot him 3 times and dumped his body in the river.
You can go down.
Agents also heard testimony from another informant that further implicated Mowat, Graves, and Lawson in the triple murder at William Ragland's house.
Down where? First and Kennedy? Huh?
He overheard Benny, Kobe, and Jermaine Graves talking about the triple homicide. And one of the things that he mentioned that they were giving Benny a hard time for was the fact that he threw up at the scene of the triple homicide. That's something that only the homicide detectives knew and that we knew and had not been released to the public.
The information was only circumstantial, but months of surveillance and informant testimony gave agents enough evidence to obtain a search warrant for the homes of Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves. They would strike at Jermaine Graves first. A heavily armed SWAT team made their way inside his house.
Please get down!
No one was there.
Oh, one more.
Agents would not leave empty-handed.
We were able to locate a 9mm gun, semi-automatic pistol, as well as some crack cocaine, what we believe to be crack cocaine. One of the members on the squad took the information that we got from the gun and put together an affidavit for an arrest warrant based on the fact that it was a convicted felon in possession of a firearm.
For several weeks, Graves eluded investigators. They continued surveillance, hoping that he would turn up.
We really didn't know where he was. We had some ideas. We knew he was still in the metro area, but obviously he knew once we hit his house that we were looking for him, and word was out on the street that we were looking for him, so he was keeping a very low profile. During one of our very standard surveillances, I saw an individual who walked like Jermaine Graves, just from the back. I couldn't see his face. So I asked one of the units to drive around the block and just take a look at the guy. And the next thing I know, they jumped out and arrested him. They knew as soon as they pulled around the corner it was him. And you know, he was arrested right on the street corner of First and Kennedy.
Just a few months after the first triple murder, Graves was off the streets. Making a case against Kobe Mowat would prove more difficult. With the arrest of gang member Jermaine Graves on a weapons charge, the FBI task force was one step closer to taking the First and Kennedy crew off of the Washington, D.C. streets. Now agents were ready to serve a search warrant on the home of the crew's leader, Kobe Mowat. A SWAT team entered the house Kobe shared with his twin brother Kareem. The two never knew what hit them. Investigators found gang-related documents, drawings, and writings, and a small amount of marijuana. They found no guns or evidence of the murders, but that was not their prime interest. The task force hunted for evidence of a larger crime pattern.
Gang videos, bad videos everywhere.
Most of the evidence we were looking for at the time was list of crew members, shirts that they all wore with the logo on them, pictures, phone books, things that would associate this group together.
The twins were arrested on drug charges and taken in for booking. Kobe's time in jail was brief. Only his brother Kareem's fingerprints were on the bag of pot. Kobe was released and the possession charge was dropped. Agents were determined to see him back behind bars.
You know what?
Investigators continued developing informants from within the gang.
You know you're supplying these guys with drugs, with guns.
They got the break they were looking
Come
for.
back to you if you don't give me information.
Facing jail time on a drug charge, a member of the First and Kennedy crew agreed to cooperate. Finally, investigators learned the answer to the question that had most plagued them.
I'll cut you a deal.
Why did Benny Lee Lawson go into police headquarters and kill two FBI agents and an MPD sergeant?
Yeah, Jimmy.
It started the night Kobe Mowat, Jermaine Graves, and Benny Lee Lawson broke into the home of William Ragland.
You stupid, man.
The trio's plan had been to rob drug dealer Gerald Gaither.
What's wrong with you?
Jermaine Graves became frustrated by Gaither's refusal to cooperate, and he snapped, killing 3 of the residents. Overwhelmed, Benny Lawson vomited outside the home. To Mowat, it was a sign of weakness.
I'm scared, man.
Jimmy, man, what's going on?
The informant continued. When Lawson was brought in for questioning by investigators, Mowat was sure Lawson had snitched. He began to tell others in the crew that Lawson was cooperating.
He was sitting around, you know, he was at the barbershop.
Benny hated snitches. He hated them. He actually pistol whipped one individual whom he thought was snitching, and probably hated him more than any other crew member. So to have Kobe think that he was ratting or snitching on him, and to go out to First and Kennedy Street crew and have the rest of the crew look at him as a snitch, we believe was more than he could handle.
Really?
For agents and investigators, it was now clear that Kobe Mowat, Jermaine Graves, and Benny Lawson had committed the triple homicide. Agents took their case to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Through these conversations and the cooperating witnesses, plus the information that the police had from the car stop the night of the triple murder, left us no doubt that they had enough to get a murder warrant for these guys for the triple murder.
It was also clear that Kobe Mowat was part of the reason Benny Lee Lawson murdered 3 investigators inside the Metropolitan Police Department. Agents finally felt ready to go before a grand jury and present their conspiracy case against Kobe Mowat and the entire crew. Among the 57 charges that were handed down were indictments for nearly a dozen homicides, drug trafficking, armed robbery, kidnapping, and racketeering. Already in custody, Graves was charged with 3 counts of felony murder. An arrest warrant was issued for Kobe Mowat. Investigators returned to his house. This time, he wasn't home. The closets had been emptied. The place looked like it had been abandoned. In the trash, investigators found a receipt for a plane ticket. It appeared that Kobe had kept his promise to flee rather than go to jail.
And the plane ticket was for just a few days before we hit the place. And the plane ticket was from New York to Moscow. And at that point, we knew that Kobe had most likely fled not only the area, but most likely the country.
Mowat was one step ahead of the agents. They tried to pick up his trail in Russia, but he was nowhere to be found. Investigators discovered there was a flight departing to Africa soon after he landed in Moscow. A check of the passenger list revealed nothing.
There you are, sir.
Agents grew increasingly more frustrated. Mowat was slipping away. For 6 months, FBI agents and Washington, D.C. police tried to track fugitive Kobe Mowat. He could be hiding anywhere. An international manhunt was underway.
We literally went months without a break. We went through hundreds and hundreds of documents that we had obtained during search warrants, during various parts of the investigation, looking for overseas phone numbers, looking for overseas relatives, once again, without a break.
After several months, Agent John Kerr got a break. Through an informant, he uncovered the name of an ex-girlfriend of Kobe's.
We had come up with addresses for her. One of the addresses we came up with, we subpoenaed the toll records, and sure enough, we found a collect call from Kenya on one of her toll records. And this was shortly after he would have arrived in Africa.
Agents brought her in for questioning. She repeatedly denied knowing anything about Kobe Mowat's whereabouts.
He's out killing people.
Agents confronted her about the phone records. If she continued to withhold information, they would serve her with a grand jury subpoena. She decided to cooperate. She told investigators that Kobe had in fact called her several times from Nairobi, Kenya. He had not called her recently. She believed he might have moved on to Tanzania. The information was immediately passed on overseas.
You have to know where he is.
Moat's phone call to his ex-girlfriend had originated from a hotel in Nairobi. A U.S. Department of State regional security officer in Kenya followed the lead.
We know he stayed in your hotel.
The hotel owner said he had no recollection of Kobe Moat. Agent Giuliano received the news.
And it becomes very, very frustrating because, once again, we're getting no new information. We're not getting a break. And we know that the only tie that we have now is this hotel in Nairobi, Kenya. So we go back to the regional security officers and ask them to go back out and re-interview the individual.
Again, the hotel owner insisted he knew nothing about Kobe Moat. When shown photographs, he seemed to hesitate. The regional security officer kept pressing. Finally, the owner asked for a guarantee that if he gave information, Kobe would never be told. The regional security officer agreed to protect him. He said Kobe had in fact been to his hotel, but he had left several months ago. He gave the security officer a number that Kobe had called while at the hotel. The call was to the East African country of Tanzania. It took agents a few days to determine why the hotel owner protected the First and Kennedy Street crew leader.
What we determined is that Kobe's mother was educated in Jamaica, and during that process she had befriended several individuals who ended up going to various parts of the world. She had an association with this hotel owner in Nairobi, and she had made the contact to protect Kobe and to help him.
You have a nice day.
Thank you.
The phone number in Tanzania eventually led investigators to a local college professor. He was a friend of Kobe Moat's mother. The FBI asked the Tanzanian National Police Department to follow the lead. The professor was unwilling to cooperate with the authorities.
Certainly not a student.
The National Police began their own investigation into Kobe Moat's whereabouts in their country. As the search for the gang leader intensified in Tanzania, agents and police in Washington, D.C. continued to build their case against the First and Kennedy crew. They amassed volumes of evidence through surveillance and informant testimony over the previous year.
There were about 20 to 25 Metropolitan Police Department officers and FBI special agents working on this investigation around the clock, whether it was determining phone records or uncovering new murders that these guys had committed over the years.
On September 14th, 1995, officers and agents executed over a dozen arrest warrants. They searched for any indication of the gang leader's whereabouts in Africa. They found nothing. They collected additional evidence of a criminal enterprise. They confiscated financial records, guns, drugs, and gang paraphernalia.
Stay right there. Don't move.
Some of those arrested agreed to cooperate in exchange for less jail time. Investigators were slowly taking all of the gang members off the streets. In Tanzania, the search for Kobe Moat was heating up. The National Police Force developed their own informants and learned that Moat had in fact been in contact with a university professor.
I don't know anything about Kobe. Perhaps I could take you on a small...
They returned to interview him. he once more denied knowing anything about Kobe. Threatening the Jamaican-born professor with deportation, the Tanzanian police convinced him to reconsider. Finally, he admitted to helping Mowat find a place to hide out. He offered to take the authorities there.
And this hut is literally out in the middle of the tribespeople who are living in straw huts or are actually just living on the ground, right amongst the wild animals and amongst where they grow their crops.
It was the last place on earth authorities would have thought to look for Mowat. Unaware that the professor had betrayed his location, Mowat was surprised to see the police approaching his hut. He set fire to anything that could potentially identify him. But the police quickly moved in and doused the flames.
What did I do?
While they searched for a reason to place him in custody, they never told Mowat why they were there.
They also determined that out in the back, he's growing a small amount of marijuana, or what they call bangi. And in that part of the country, it's against the law. And the penalty is 10 years in prison or $100. So they bought him in based on that premise, telling him that he was going to be incarcerated for that.
Investigators in Washington received the news that Mowat was in custody, but time was working against them. The Tanzanian police could only hold Kobe on the possession charge for a short period. As a drug trafficker, Mowat had plenty of cash on hand to pay the $100 fine. After days of diplomatic wrangling, the arrangements for Mowat's extradition to the United States were finalized. Agent Giuliano and Detective Brigadini traveled to Tanzania to take him into custody. Investigators were finally face to face with the man who had eluded them for over a year.
When he came in, Kobe looked tired, and he looked like he had been defeated. We explained to him what the charges were, that he was being removed to the United States, that he had been indicted in the United States for a variety of charges, including several counts of first-degree murder and racketeering.
Mowat was on his way back to the United States, where he and fellow gang members faced 57 indictments. Kobe Mowat and Jermaine Graves would be convicted on all counts. They were each sentenced to 35 years in a federal prison. Mowat's capture in Africa allowed investigators to get the remaining First and Kennedy crew members off the streets.
When we brought Kobe back to the United States, he just had a domino effect on the rest of the crew members. Eventually, every crew member pled guilty because they felt and actually told us that once they saw that we had found Kobe in East Africa and brought him back, that they felt they didn't stand a chance.
FBI agents and DC police worked tirelessly to bring justice to the victims of gang violence. But this case was also personal. Only after the entire gang was in jail could they have a sense of closure and feel they had vindicated the deaths of their friends, Sergeant Hank Daly and FBI agents Mike Miller and Martha Dixon Martinez. For Agent John Kufta, who barely survived the attack at police headquarters, the implications of this case were far-reaching.
When this group was locked up, I think it sent a clear message to other criminal organizations out there operating in the District of Columbia and in that tri-state area there, that the FBI and the DC police will go to whatever lengths are necessary if it takes them to other continents to track you down and find you and bring you back to the United States to justice.
In New York in the 1980s, the emergence of crack cocaine brought a new wave of violence. Drug dealers robbed and killed as they scrambled for power. Ordinary citizens were victimized. Even children were not immune. The FBI joined forces with the New York City police to take back the streets. Their best weapon against deadly drug gangs was the C-11 squad.
New York City is no stranger to gang violence. But when a 12-year-old child was kidnapped, the gangs had crossed a line. Law enforcement raced to find the missing boy before it was too late. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Agents would have to infiltrate the secretive world of a vicious gang to stop the murderous exploits of a drug lord.
In the 1980s, crack cocaine invaded the Harlem section of New York, as it did many urban areas in America. Over time, the cheap and highly addictive drug crippled communities unlike any other drug had before. With the crack came ruthlessly violent gangs that ruled the streets. No one was truly safe. On December 5th, 1989, 12-year-old Donnell Porter was walking to elementary school alone. He never made it to class that day. When he didn't arrive home after school, his family worried. They hadn't been able to find him in the neighborhood. At 9 p.m., Donnell's sister received a phone call.
Yeah.
A man on the other end said Donnell had been kidnapped. He wanted $500,000 or the boy would be killed.
Inside the men's bathroom.
The sister said the family didn't have that kind of money. It didn't matter to the caller.
Yeah.
He warned them not to contact police, then instructed them to go to a restaurant at 125th and Broadway. Behind a trash can in the restroom, they'd find something that would prove he was serious.
You got it?
A family friend went to the restaurant so the Porters could stay by the phone. He didn't know if it was a setup. Following the kidnapper's orders, he checked behind the trash container and found a coffee can. Inside were 2 rings, an audio cassette, and a child's severed finger. Donnell was hurt and could be bleeding to death. Despite being warned not to, the family called the New York City police.
Following you, looking at you. Nobody standing around.
The family told investigators what they knew. Detectives inspected the evidence. The sister said that the rings belonged to Donnell. They'd been given to the boy by his older brother. On the tape, a recorded plea for help was definitely Donnell's voice. The family told detectives about a second call in which the kidnapper had lowered his ransom to $350,000. It was still far beyond their means. They said they didn't know why they were targeted for such a high ransom. But detectives knew what the family wouldn't say.
So you came straight back.
The victim's older brother, Richard Porter, was a major crack cocaine dealer in the area. Police believe the kidnapping was related to his drug empire. NYPD contacted the New York FBI's reactive squad for assistance. Special Agent David Higgins, a narcotics expert, was asked to provide more intelligence on Richard Porter.
Anything they got, any of them. Richard Porter, then about 25 years of age, was a well-known crack dealer whose activities took place in central Harlem. He was one of those individuals who got in early on the crack trade in New York, and he had created a significant drug empire in central Harlem.
Richard Porter had made millions of dollars selling crack on New York's streets. Detectives knew where his turf was.
What's going on, man?
It didn't take long to find Porter. Detectives recognized the person he was with as his drug-running partner, Alpo Martinez. This visit wasn't about drugs. It was about finding Donnell. Porter agreed to come to the station for an interview, though he said he didn't know how he could help.
Look, guys, I don't know anything.
Police knew Porter was very close to Donnell, but he claimed to know nothing about who was behind his brother's kidnapping. On the streets, these matters are usually solved without the cops. Though Porter most likely held the key to finding Donnell, he was in no position to talk to authorities.
Richard Porter, because of his situation as a drug trafficker, found himself in a ticklish situation legally. It would have been difficult for him to cooperate directly with law enforcement. I believe he attempted to handle this situation on his own to some extent.
Police had nothing to hold him on. Authorities needed to find someone else to help them. They canvassed the area, trying to gather information on the kidnapping. In such a close-knit neighborhood, someone had to have heard something about Donnell. But residents were too afraid to talk. Harlem's violent gangs had a stranglehold on the community. Detectives were left with nothing. With each passing day, police in NYPD's 32nd precinct knew Donnell's chance of survival decreased. Investigators maintained contact with the boy's family, who were desperate for more word from the kidnappers.
We need to get to the bottom of it.
A week after the abduction, the family received a note. In it, the kidnappers hinted Donnell was still alive. They demanded their money. But no more ransom calls came. With no clues to the boy's whereabouts and no one talking, police had reached a dead end. They somehow needed to pressure Richard Porter into cooperating, or hope he would pay the ransom to get Donnell back. Then, on January 4th, 1990, a month after Donnell's abduction, the body of his brother, drug kingpin Richard Porter, was found in a Bronx park. He had been shot twice, in the head and chest. There would be no one to pay the ransom now.
It was widely assumed that Richard's death was connected to the kidnapping and probably the result of a ransom payment gone bad. However, it was noted early on that when his body was discovered, his wallet contained over $2,000 in U.S. currency. His jewelry was there. Apparently his automobile was nearby. So there was some question about what the actual motivations were behind his murder.
Little boy's missing fingers.
With Richard Porter's death, investigators lost their closest connection to the abducted 12-year-old. To find another source, they increased pressure on lower-level dealers in Porter's organization.
Where'd this come from?
Facing drug charges, they were offered leniency in exchange for information. Some said Porter's partner, Alpo Martinez, could be involved. Others claimed an infamous Harlem gang called the Preacher Crew might be. But none offered direct leads to the crime. 3 weeks later, a boy's body was recovered in the same Bronx park where Richard Porter was found. His family identified the body of Donnell Porter. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head.
Death of a child is always a disturbing event. There's a 12-year-old boy, he's on the way to public school. He's kidnapped, tortured. He's heard on the tape cassette crying for help from his family.
Donnell's murder stunned the entire Harlem community, even though violence was a daily occurrence there. At the time, Sergeant James Marr worked NYPD's notorious 32nd Precinct, where Donnell lived.
In the late 80s and the early 90s, the 32nd Precinct, which is actually geographically only 1 square mile, was one of the most violent precincts in New York City. They averaged in the area of the upper 60s to low 70s of homicides a year, and added on to that were shootings, several hundred shootings, that the people didn't die.
In response to the increased violence in the city, a task force called the C-11 Squad had been formed at the FBI's New York field office. Detectives from the 32nd Precinct and FBI agents were assigned to the squad.
C-11 was created to address these entrenched criminal conspiracy groups in the city of New York. The locals brought their knowledge of the streets, the knowledge of the subjects involved to the table. The federal agents brought along with them the access to the federal courts, which included the access to the federal sentencing guidelines in the United States Attorney's Office.
After the murder of Donnell Porter, they knew they had to take back the streets. C-11 would first go after Alpo Martinez, Richard Porter's partner.
The problem is here we haven't.
If their partnership had unraveled, he would have had the most to gain from extorting Richard Porter and killing him.
We're still working on some surveillance.
A year earlier, a warrant had been sworn out for his arrest on drug charges. But when Martinez couldn't be found, federal prosecutors had to drop the warrant. In police computers, the C-11 squad flagged the names of known associates of Alpo Martinez. If any were arrested, they would be notified. Months later, police in Washington, D.C. pulled over a car after observing its driver engage in a drug deal. The driver was a known courier for Alpo Martinez. Police found a large amount of crack and thousands of dollars in his car. Noting the flag on his record from New York, D.C. authorities would contact the C-11 squad. After the courier was sentenced to 20 years to life on drug charges, C-11 agents had him transported to New York for an interview.
I want some information about him because we want...
An agent explained that under federal law, his sentence could be reviewed if he cooperated with authorities.
You're just making this difficult on yourself. Where does he... All I know...
He told what he knew about Martinez and Porter's East Coast drug operation.
Drugs would be distributed both in New York City by Richard Porter and in Washington, D.C. by Alpo Martinez. While in Washington, D.C., Martinez allied himself
with individuals that he found to be strong on the street, if you will, in order to protect his drug operation in Washington, D.C. And it was not unusual for literally sea bags worth of U.S. currency to be shipped out of Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. up into the Porter neighborhood at 132nd and 7th Avenue in New York City.
It was enough for a renewed arrest warrant on Alpo Martinez. Agents canvassed the neighborhood, talking to people who knew Martinez. Most were afraid to talk. Eventually, agents learned the fugitive was going to pick up his wife's car at a dealership in northern New Jersey. Undercover agents staked out the dealership. They didn't know if Martinez would show up, but they knew he liked fast cars. That afternoon, a sports car pulled up. They watched a passenger get out, but it wasn't Martinez.
There he goes. He's going over to the building. I'm coming over.
Agents couldn't tell if the fugitive was driving. They had to risk a closer look. If they could arrest Martinez, it might help solve the murders of Richard Porter and his 12-year-old brother, Donnell. An agent visually identified Martinez as the driver. He radioed a go-ahead signal. But before the arrest team could respond, Martinez spun away. Agents gave chase, but the fugitive disappeared into heavy traffic. With Alpo Martinez still a fugitive, the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Donnell Porter remained unsolved. The abduction and murder of 12-year-old Donnell Porter showed that Harlem's drug violence was out of control. The FBI's C-11 squad knew the murder was connected to the boy's brother, crack dealer Richard Porter. But Porter himself had been killed. C-11 believed finding Porter's partner, Alpo Martinez, would provide answers. But in 1991, Martinez had eluded an FBI undercover operation. From the incident, the FBI got his license plate number and alerted New York police to be on the lookout for the vehicle. The next day, police spotted it, parked on a Harlem street. They impounded it, hoping it might lead to Martinez. They believed the fugitive wouldn't retrieve the vehicle himself, but FBI Special Agent David Higgins waited to see if he'd send someone.
A young lady showed up who claimed to be the true owner. She was the registered owner. Ultimately, a quick investigation established that she was what we call a straw man, or somebody who had stepped forward in order to buy and register the car on behalf of Mr. Martinez.
Martinez was nowhere to be found in New York. Acting on a tip that he had traveled to Washington, D.C., agents set up surveillance at the D.C. home of the fugitive's ex-wife. In the early hours of November 7th, 1991, they spotted Martinez getting into his ex-wife's vehicle. This time, he wasn't driving. As they pulled out, the FBI made their move. The fugitive's ex-wife pulled over. The cocaine in his possession helped cement the case against one of the biggest drug traffickers on the East Coast.
Ultimately, Mr. Martinez pled guilty to an indictment in the Eastern District of Virginia, which accused him of trafficking in over 1,000 kilograms of cocaine. The wholesale value of that would be $20 million.
Richie Rich, who killed him?
Investigators also had evidence against Martinez on several gangland murders. They told him they knew he was Richard Porter's partner, so he stood to gain from Donnell's and Richard's death. Hoping to avoid the death penalty, Alpo Martinez agreed to cooperate. He admitted killing his partner, Richard Porter.
Just like we always do on the weekend or whatever. It didn't seem like
Martinez had begun to suspect his partner had been cheating him out of hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So then from there,
He said that more than a year earlier, on January 4th, 1990, he and an associate had taken Richard Porter for a ride. Almost immediately, Martinez and the associate each shot him. They dumped his body in the Bronx Park, where it was found the next day.
talking about it, kill my kid. I don't know.
Martinez swore it was just about missing drug money.
Yo, I didn't kill no
It had nothing to do with Donnell Porter's kidnapping and murder. No evidence or testimony linked Martinez to that crime. He went to prison for life. Although they had put away a major drug dealer, the local and federal investigators of the C-11 squad were no closer to solving the murder of Donnell Porter. They reviewed FBI intelligence already gathered on other Harlem gangsters who might have profited from extorting and killing Richard Porter. One gang stood out as likely suspects. They were known as the Preacher Crew. The gang's leader was Clarence Preacher Heatley. FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh, formerly of the C-11 squad, knew the Preacher and his crew were well entrenched and very dangerous.
Preacher Crew was the established crew in the neighborhood, for a long time. Preacher had been kicking around the streets of Harlem since the early 70s, and everybody knew him by his nickname, the Black Hand of Death, and everybody was deathly afraid of him.
NYPD Sergeant James Marr of the C-11 squad learned the Preacher had a reputation for violence. But the gangster was an elusive figure in Harlem.
You could walk up to anybody in the 32nd precinct, no matter how church-going they are, no matter whether they're businessmen or local drug dealers, they all have a Preacher story. They all know who Preacher is. Ask any of them to describe Preacher to you, or a majority of them, they're not going to be able to. Because this guy was an infamous legend in Harlem.
The players in Harlem's drug underworld had carved up the area into zones. Each block, each alley was the established turf of a single dealer. Most dealers respected the boundaries. But the Preacher did not. He considered all of Harlem his turf. He made his money not by dealing drugs, but by taxing other dealers.
But he was mostly into extortion, extorting drug dealers. These are guys that were violent in their own right. He would go up and claim their car. If a drug dealer looked like he was getting paid, so to say, he was driving a brand new full-size Mercedes-Benz, and Preacher liked that car, that was Preacher's.
Those who argued with Preacher paid a heavy price. It was a system that made him a rich man.
If you're hitting every other drug dealer on the streets, 2,000 here, 3,000 here, 5,000 there, that's a lot of money. It adds up. And believe me, they all paid, because if they didn't pay, Preacher would pay him a visit, or he would order his people to pay him a visit, and they'd wind up dead.
The Preacher's history of extortion and violence made him a likely suspect in the abduction and murder of Donnell Porter. C-11 had outlined the basic structure of the Preacher crew.
Including some of his other main guys in his crew.
The Preacher's main lieutenant was a man named John Cuff. He was a particularly dangerous criminal, according to C-11's detective Vinnie Flynn.
John Cuff was an ex-New York City housing cop. As a cop, he provided protection and bodyguard work for Preacher. So if they were driving through the neighborhood and were stopped, John Cuff had a shield where he would probably be let go and not given a summons or anything further would happen. John Cuff had a reputation of one to be feared, very violent person.
Yet no evidence linked either man to Donnell Porter. Though C-11 suspected Preacher was involved in the deadly kidnapping, he probably didn't commit it himself. He distanced himself from most of the crimes, having his main lieutenant and other henchmen carry out his orders.
I know you got some money. I know you got some money, man.
At Preacher's command, their brutal extortion tactics earned them money and kept witnesses too intimidated to talk, effectively insulating the crew against investigation.
We go into a bodega or someplace up in Holland, and we'd say, we know he came in here, and the guy would have a cast on his hand. We know he broke your hand, and the shop owner would say, I don't know what you're talking about, and that shop owner would be paying rent, or taxed into Preacher, but nobody would tell us anything.
With people too afraid to talk, crimes continued to pile up. On New Year's Eve, 1992, emergency units responded to a call in the Preacher's territory. A man lay dead in his car, the victim of a drive-by shooting. His family survived the harrowing ordeal. They described how the killers pulled up next to them on the street and opened fire. They claimed they didn't know who did it or why. And like Donnell's kidnapping, no one in the neighborhood admitted seeing anything. It was another tragic killing in Harlem that might go unsolved. The C-11 squad had to breach the area's violently enforced code of silence and finally get insiders to talk. A shocking drive-by shooting was added to the list of unsolved murders in Harlem. With witnesses too afraid to cooperate with police, the case was open for 2 years. Then in 1994, the C-11 squad found a witness who told them the shooter was a Preacher crew member named Malik. Detective Vinnie Flynn learned that Malik had a violent reputation.
He became a so-called director of security for the Preacher organization. He was in charge of the group of members who were known as the janitors. The janitors were the people that had to clean up the problems or the mess of the family. And you couldn't be a janitor unless you killed somebody.
To get more on Malik and the Preacher crew, C-11 tried to send in undercover officers. It was yet another dead end, according to FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh.
We weren't able to really get in, so to speak, and get an undercover in there to buy narcotics from Preacher, because Preacher was very, very careful. He was, he's a very smart man, and we couldn't get the undercover, close to him.
The Preacher had closed ranks, ordering the people he extorted not to sell to new buyers and to keep a low profile on the street. Investigators needed a witness with close ties to the crew. They distributed business cards, hoping one would find its way to an insider willing to talk. Their persistence paid off. In April 1994, a crew member contacted the C-11 squad because he realized his life was in danger. He said the preacher had started going after his own crew members. Preacher had killed 2 of the informant's partners. Fearing he was next, he asked Sergeant James Marr for protection.
It was a stone-cold killer himself who became an informant that was so fearful of Preacher and of being killed like his partners had that he came to me, that he came to us, that he gave us information on specific crimes, that he talked about crimes that had been unsolved for years.
Investigators were frustrated that the informant knew nothing of 12-year-old Donnell Porter's kidnapping and murder. But he did give investigators their first specific insider information about Preacher Heatley's organization. He mentioned a killing basement that the crew used as a meeting place and execution chamber. At some meetings, Preacher would call for a vote on the fate of gang members who had fallen out of favor. If the majority voted thumbs down, Preacher ordered a murder. In March 1994, Preacher called for a vote on Malik, the janitor who had done the drive-by shooting. He believed Malik could no longer be trusted. The vote was thumbs down.
Yeah, what's up?
Preacher summoned Malik to headquarters.
How y'all doing? All right, most love, man. Most love, man. Most love. How you doing? I ain't seen you all the time. What you been at, man? Most love. Know it, man. How it is?
Malik thought he was there to take part in the beating of a crew member that he had had problems with in the past.
Yeah, I know he's flinging, man. All right, word.
Not realizing he was the real target, Malik was excited when others invited him to the basement.
If you went down there and you were followed in there, you know, somebody was behind you, you weren't coming out alive.
Yo, son, let's go get this dude, son. Let's go get him. We're gonna do this, man. We're gonna do this, dude. Yo, oh shit. Priest, what's up, man? What's up? What you doing? Oh, man. Yo, Preacher, man, come on.
Preacher told Malik he had to die. He was gaining too much influence within the organization. Preacher wouldn't tolerate it. Malik pleaded for his life. But the order had been given.
Grab the saw, son. Clean him up.
At Preacher's command, other janitors used a circular saw to dismember Malik. The informant said that Preacher ordered him and another crew member to dispose of the body parts.
This is the guy you work for, right?
They poured acid on Malik's arms to remove gang tattoos that could link him to the crew. Then they left the body parts in several crumbling, abandoned buildings.
They kept Malik's head in a refrigerator for a couple of weeks, and they kind of paraded it around on a stick. You know, that's how Preacher would, keep the fear of God, so to speak, in the younger Turks in his organization.
The fear was too much for the informant, though he knew leaving the crew was equivalent to a death sentence. He hoped the C-11 squad could protect him. It didn't take long for word to get back to the Preacher that the informant had cooperated. One day, the informant was leaving a New York courthouse when he spotted Preacher in cuff. He was sure they were there to abduct and kill him. He went to his car and called his C-11 handlers.
The informant advised me that his fear that he was going to be killed by the organization, he was going to be abducted. right in the middle of the afternoon in front of the courthouse.
The agents of C11 rushed to stop another murder in the preacher's territory.
I'm scared to death.
A former member of the preacher crew feared the gang was out to kill him for cooperating with authorities. Agents and detectives from the FBI C11 squad came to his aid just in time. They arrested Maine Lieutenant John Cuff and the crew leader himself, Clarence Preacher Heatley. Sergeant James Marr and the other arresting agents searched the vehicle.
There was evidence inside, including information about my informant, masks, tape. It was apparent at the time that my informant's feelings were right. He was going to be abducted that day.
Come on, man. Hurry up my
But no one could prove that the men were coming to kill the informant.
20 minutes, all it took. I told you.
The preacher and Cuff were released.
Come on, man. I got things to do, man. Hurry up.
The incident brought the C11 squad's investigation of the crew into the open.
20 minutes, all it took.
Have a nice day.
Nice day, officer.
That's when it became apparent that they were being investigated by the FBI. I mean, here's this detective that they know from the 3-2, that when he does make an arrest, makes arrests with FBI agents. It became apparent to Cuff and Preacher that the FBI was breathing down their neck.
Preacher further insulated himself. The FBI would have to get him by going after his organization. To prosecute, they would use federal racketeering statutes known as RICO. Originally designed to bring down organized crime families, RICO requires that strict criteria are met, according to FBI Special Agent Joe Walsh.
You have to have your organization, you have to have your leader, which in this case was Preacher, and he has to have 5 or more people working underneath him, you know, to facilitate the conspiracy of the organization. But you also need 3 predicate offenses, 3 federal offenses.
The C11 investigators surveilled the Preacher crew, gathering evidence on offenses to support the RICO case. They noticed unrest within the gang. It seemed the pressure of C11's investigation was getting to the Preacher. From an informant, agents learned he even ordered the murder of his Maine lieutenant, John Cuff. Agents were obligated to warn Cuff of the hit.
I reached for my shield. He goes, "I know who you are. You don't have to show me your shield." I said, "You know, John, I just wanted to let you know that there's a contract out in your life, and I swear there's nothing but space when you look in his eyes." And he goes, "Everybody wants me dead."
Coming in, man. Come on, man.
Cuff was undaunted by the threat. Though the Preacher was tightening his grip on his men, investigators still needed to get evidence of the crimes the crew committed to support the racketeering organization. As more buyers and sellers were arrested, some agreed to cooperate, helping to outline the group in detail, according to Detective Vinnie Flynn.
We obtained informants through narcotics investigations, arrests made by the 3-2 precinct and the 3-2 detective squad, through information they developed and informants they developed. Because of arrest, information was compiled, which built a case against the Preacher crew.
About some murders. What murders do you know about?
Unfortunately, no one had information on the Donnell Porter murder.
There was this girl who went to the park, you know, and so we took her back.
But one arrested crew member offered details of another murder committed by the crew, hoping for leniency. He said they decided they didn't want to pay for a shipment of drugs.
right? Is that
I don't know.
They told the supplier that a young woman had stolen them and that they would take care of her. She was a single mother who sometimes worked as a courier for the crew.
So, did you see them black?
They brought her to a Harlem apartment, telling her they wanted her to hear a record they had produced.
Look it up.
She hadn't stolen any drugs. That didn't matter to the crew. The informant explained how they cleaned up the crime scene, then dumped the body in an abandoned building. He couldn't remember exactly which building it was. In August 1996, after more than 5 years of meticulous investigation, the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Southern District of New York decided they had enough for indictments and arrests on federal RICO charges. The first indictment was against Clarence Preacher Heatley and John Cuff. The indictment was kept sealed. If word got out to the preacher, he might disappear forever. Investigators staked out Preacher's Harlem headquarters. They hoped news of the indictments hadn't been leaked, and that if they found him, they could arrest him without a fight. They knew Preacher was surrounded by armed men, willing to kill at his command. In late 1996, the C-11 squad was ready to arrest Clarence Preacher Heatley. No one had seen him in days. On August 12th, he emerged from his headquarters building. Detectives made sure he was alone, then moved in.
Preacher, drop the phone! Drop the phone! Drop the phone! Let me see your hands! Put it down! Get on the car! Get on the car! Get on the car! Hands on the car! Hands on the car!
As he was arrested, the elusive gang leader remained relaxed and confident. As soon as he was in custody, other teams arrested his main lieutenant, John Cuff. 2 months later, 15 more Preacher crew members were indicted. Arrest teams prepared for simultaneous takedowns. They had to strike fast, full force, to arrest gang members safely. Detective Vinnie Flynn and other C-11 investigators developed more cooperating witnesses among the arrested crew members.
Once people were arrested and being prosecuted, they agreed to cooperate, and they felt that they were used by the Preacher crew, and felt that if, in some cases, if they didn't participate, they would have been killed too. So this was their way out of the Preacher crew and from under Clarence Heatley's control.
Investigators learned in which Harlem buildings the crew dumped some of their victims. Finding physical evidence was crucial in order to prosecute the RICO case. One building was a shell, partially collapsed on the inside, further complicating the retrieval. After days of excavating tons of rubble, a body was discovered. Lab examiners determined it was the body of the young mother who had been killed as a cover for stolen drugs. She had been shot in an apartment in an adjacent building. Evidence response teams checked the apartment.
That's the apartment where they kept Malik's head. And in the refrigerator, there was a lot of blood still left in the apartment. And inside the refrigerator, there was Malik's blood from when where they kept his head. They were able to trace that at the lab.
Malik and several others had been killed in the basement of the preacher's headquarters. Crime scene technicians processed the basement. Arrested crew members said Preacher had them scrub the place with boric acid after each killing. Most of the basement was clean.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Right there.
But technicians were able to recover traces of blood on the windows and on the saw blade that had been used to dismember Malik. But the investigation was not over. The abduction and murder of young Donnell Porter was still unsolved.
Come on in, gentlemen. Have a seat.
Answers about his death finally came from an unlikely source. An assistant district attorney convinced the boy's uncle, preacher crew member John Apple Porter, to come in to talk. He was one of the crew's main players left on the street and had been labeled a snitch. 2 attempts had been made on his life. The DA suggested that Porter cooperate to earn protection in prison. He confessed to several murders and revealed what happened to his nephew Donnell. According to Sergeant James Marr, the kidnapping was prompted by jealousy and greed.
The underlying factor with Johnny Porter, Johnny Apples, with the kidnapping was when he came home from prison, Richie Porter, his nephew, was this big Harlem drug dealer. He was getting paid. Richie Porter used to wear a lot of gold, used to really like flashy cars. He was making a lot of money, and he wasn't giving any to Johnny Porter. And Johnny Porter felt he was owed this, and he decided to take it. And the way he took it is he snatched the kid.
Porter said the preacher agreed to the kidnapping. He sent one of his janitors, Malik, to help. They believed Richard Porter would pay anything to get his brother back.
No.
They kept the boy in a basement where no one would hear him.
What's up, Sean? You gonna make a take for us?
They cut off his finger and recorded the boy's pleas for help to prove to his family they were serious. Apple and Preacher hoped for $500,000, enough to set Apple up in his own drug trade and enough to cripple Richard Porter.
What time was it?
When Richard couldn't come up with that amount of cash, they lowered it to $350,000.
Did you hold that in his hand?
Then the unexpected happened. Preacher and Apple learned that Richard Porter was murdered. There'd be no ransom.
You sure about that?
Make the call.
Preacher Heatley later told Special Agent Joe Walsh about his decision.
Our preacher sat right down in a room and told me exactly what happened. He looked me right in the eye and said, I couldn't let that boy live after what had happened.
Yeah.
John Porter insisted that it was Malik who actually did the killing. Malik was later killed and dismembered at the preacher's command. John Porter was sentenced to natural life. Because of the evidence collected by the C-11 squad, each member of the preacher crew went to prison. Their leader, Clarence Preacher Heatley, pled guilty to federal racketeering charges that included drug trafficking, assault, and murder. He was sentenced to life with no chance of parole. He and his crew will never again terrorize the streets of Harlem.
It's estimated that they're responsible for approximately 45 murders that we're aware of. Numerous robberies. If you add the extortion in, these people were a decade-long or better crime wave in themselves. They were just amazing, the devastation that they caused in these communities.
That changed when the C-11 squad dismantled the preacher crew forever. Since the case was closed, Harlem has seen a rebirth.
Harlem today, the 32nd precinct, is running somewhere between 15 and 20 homicides a year, down from the 70s, down from 70 a year in the late 80s during the crack cocaine binge. I think we accomplished quite a bit with this case. And the drug organization doesn't exist anymore, so we can't hurt anybody else.